Hola amigos. So in these lessons in which we are going to talk about the women from Latin America, today's lesson focuses on the indigenous women of Latin America, and we are going to look at some inspiring stories from the region. As you know, there are an estimated 45 million indigenous people who live in Latin America, and they belong to nearly 800 ethnic groups. In fact, they were the original inhabitants of this region and they have a rich and ancestral culture. However, since the times of the Spanish conquest, they endured slavery, massacres, forced migration, and exclusion from the mainstream social and economic systems. In the face of centuries of hardships, the indigenous people have shown tremendous resilience and ability to survive. As you know, they are called Indios in Spanish. Because when Christopher Columbus arrived in Americas in 1492, looking for a shorter sea route to India, he actually thought he had reached India and started calling the native people Indios. Though there were several indigenous communities in the vast regions of the Americas in those times, today mainly three are predominant. The Quechuas, they are the original descendants of the Inca Empire, and they inhabit the Andean regions of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And then you have the Mayas, who trace their ancestry to some 4,000 years back when the ancient Maya civilization began in Central America and spread in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Maya culture reached its peak in the Classic period, which is about 250 to 900 AD. They had pioneering advances in architecture, math, astronomy, agriculture, and art. In fact, they are very famous for their numerical system and calendar, which are still in use today. And in 50 before Christ, the Maya were even the first people in all of the Western Hemisphere to keep written historical records. Then we have the Aymaras. They reside in the high plains of the Andes, in the mountains in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. The Aymaras are the descendants of the earliest tribes of South America, dating back to between 500 and 200 BC. Interestingly, as the Inca Empire began dominating most regions of the continent, economically and politically, the Aymara people are the only group to be granted the privilege of retaining their language and culture. The 5 Latin American countries with the highest indigenous populations are Bolivia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, and Peru. Today, the indigenous people in Latin America are asserting themselves politically and socially. Bolivia, for example, the state with the largest indigenous populace, about 62% of its total population, elected the continent's first ever indigenous president in 2005, Evo Morales. Under Evo Morales, Bolivia reformed the national constitution in 2009 to recognize the country as a plurinational state with 36 different indigenous cultures, each with its own language. In fact, in December 1994, the United Nations proclaimed 1995-2004 decade as the International Decade of the World's Indigenous People. In Latin America, whose indigenous peoples comprise some 10% of the total population, this decade coincided with an upsurge of indigenous movements. Latin American indigenous women have been at the forefront of these social movements. Indigenous women have and continue to play key leadership roles in their communities. In the late 80s, several indigenous women like Nina Pacari Vega and Blanca Chancoso from Ecuador, Rigoberta Menchú and Rosalina Tuyeye from Guatemala, and Tarsila Rivera Sea from Peru led the movement that was emerging as part of the 1992 commemoration of 500 years of Columbus's arrival on the American continent. The 500-year anniversary was the unifying factor for Indigenous people that prompted them to reflect on their condition and to take action. Today, we will look at the legendary Indigenous women from Latin America. And the very first name that would come to anybody's mind is that of Rigoberta Menchú Tum, the human rights activist from Guatemala who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Rigoberta Menchú was born in 1959 in Guatemala in a large peasant family which had descended from the ancient Maya Quiché culture. Her father was himself a land rights activist, and her mother was an indigenous expert in childbirth in rural areas where doctors did not arrive. Since her childhood, Rigoberta had seen injustice, discrimination, and exploitation towards indigenous people living in the poor areas of Guatemala, and she became involved very young in the struggles of indigenous peoples, which also led to her persecution and then to her exile. Her parents and brothers were killed by the army during the period of repression, which is around 1960 to 1996, the repression against the indigenous peasant and guerrilla movements in Guatemala. In 1980, Rigoberta was exiled to Mexico, and she went to Geneva, where she participated in a working group of the United Nations on indigenous populations to vindicate and promote the rights and defend the lives of all indigenous peoples of America. In 1992, she became the first Indian, that is indigenous, and the youngest woman ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her contribution to social justice and reconciliation among different ethnic groups. She said, "Soy hija de la miseria y la desigualdad social. Soy un caso ilustrativo de marginación por ser maya y mujer. He sobrevivido el genocidio y la crueldad." Which in English would be, "I'm the daughter of poverty and social inequality. I'm the illustrative case of marginalization, being Maya and being a woman. I have survived genocide and cruelty." With the Nobel Prize money, she created the Vicente Menchú Foundation after her father's name to help the most needy and not necessarily only the indigenous. From 1994, she returned from her exile to live in Guatemala, and she has been appointed Goodwill Ambassador for the International Year of Indigenous Peoples, and in 1998, she also received the Príncipe de Asturias Prize, the Prince of Asturias Prize, given by the Kings of Spain, in defense and dignity of women. She has served as personal advisor to the Director General of UNESCO and chair of Indigenous Initiative for Peace. She's a tireless advocate for respect for human rights and for all indigenous peoples. She continues to work to resolve social hardships. For this exemplary woman, all this struggle is for a better future. And she says, "Soñemos un milenio de paz, sin derramamientos de sangre, que nos involucremos en la lucha para la paz, que sintamos amor y entrega por la humanidad." Which in English would be something like this: "Let's dream of a millennium of peace without bloodshed. Let's get involved in the fight for peace. Let's feel love and dedication to humanity." Menchú's voice was first heard all over the world in 1983 when she recounted her life story to Venezuelan anthropologist Elizabeth Burgos Debre and published the book Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia. The English translation is I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian woman in Guatemala. Now, Burgos Debre assembled the text from tape-recorded interviews she had conducted with the 23-year-old Menchú in Paris the year before. She revised and arranged the transcripts into a book, and its international popularity has caused the book to be translated into more than 12 languages, and Menchu's work became an internationally influential image of the atrocities committed by the Guatemalan army in peasant villages. Let's read the opening paragraph of the book. Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú. Tengo 23 años. Quisiera dar este testimonio vivo que no he aprendido en un libro y que tampoco he aprendido sola, ya que todo esto lo he aprendido con mi pueblo y es algo que yo quisiera enfocar. Me cuesta mucho recordarme toda una vida que he vivido, pues muchas veces hay tiempos muy negros y hay tiempos que sí se goza también. Pero lo importante es, yo creo, que quiero hacer un enfoque que no soy la única, pues ha vivido mucha gente y es la vida de todos, la vida de todos los guatemaltecos pobres, y trataré de dar un poco mi historia. Mi situación personal engloba toda la realidad de un pueblo. And now in English. My name is Rigoberta Menchú. I'm 23 years old. This is my testimony. I didn't learn it from a book, and I didn't learn it alone. I'd like to stress that it's not only my life, it's also the testimony of my people. It's hard for me to remember everything that's happened to me in my life, since there have been very many bad times, but yes, moments of joy as well. The important thing is that what has happened to me has happened to many other people too. My story is the story of all poor Guatemalans. My personal experience is the reality of a whole people. Rigoberta Menchú's struggle for Indigenous people's rights has accorded her international recognition and spread a message of peace, equality, and justice in the entire world. She is a symbol of strength of the Indigenous women and reminds us of a long history of such courageous women in Latin America. Since 1983, September 5 is celebrated as Indigenous Women's Day, a day that pays homage to all Indigenous women who gave themselves in body and soul to improve the destiny of their families and their people. It is celebrated in the memory of a brave woman, Bartolina Sisa, who fought against the oppression of colonial Spanish rulers and was murdered on September 5, 1782. Bartolina Sisa was born in 1753, and she was a woman dedicated to the work of looms. She was a weaver and she was a spinner. She married the leader Tupac Catar, and together with him, she organized one of the early indigenous resistances of the Andean people against the Spanish colonial yoke in Cusco, in Peru. Years later, she was hanged by the Spanish colonizers, and she has been considered the most courageous woman of the time. In the condemnation of such a brutal murder, social organizations pay homage to her on this day, and an emotional recognition is given to one of the Indigenous women who gave her life in the struggle for the freedom of her people. The Indigenous women of Latin America play a very important role in the survival of Indigenous peoples, their customs, their language, their culture, in the transmission of the culture to their descendants, and in their constant and persistent struggle against ethnic and cultural exclusion. They are the pillar of the family, for which they give their whole life and for which their daily dedication is absolute. She's in charge of taking care of the children and teaching them all about Indigenous culture that later they will teach to their own children. The struggle of our Indigenous peoples to obtain the same rights as other people is an ongoing struggle. Remembering women like Rigoberta Menchú or Bartolina Sisa and thousands others serves to remind ourselves and to become aware of how to end the exclusions so that they have the same rights and opportunities to live and develop in a world as any other citizen. So today, we have told you the story of these two brave indigenous women from Latin America.